Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the fifth and final part in a series on what I like to call little words with big impact. Now, if you've been following this series, you know we're talking about these little words that are called prepositions or preverbs. They often introduce a phrase, but they can also be attached to verbs and modify the verb in some way. Here are some native English ones, but for our purposes, we are looking at prepositions or preverbs that we have borrowed from the Latin and Greek languages. And so if you know what this relative handful of little words mean, then you will be able to understand our English vocabulary better because we have just borrowed so many of them. So it's taken 5 parts to this series to go through all of them. This is finally the last one where we are going to sum this up and talk about some of the last semantic sets that we are going to be looking at. And those 2 sets are 2 diametrically opposite semantic fields, which are under and over. And so we're going to start with some words that mean something in the area of under. Obviously, these are words like under, below, or down. So we're going to be looking at some Greek and Latin words that mean something in this general range. You probably are very familiar with the very first word we're going to look at here. This is the Latin word sub, which just meant under or below. We have stolen this directly into English. It is a productive prefix, which means that we can pretty much just slap it onto anything and we know what it means. So I don't really need to tell you what this word means. However, I've chosen some words to look at where we might not necessarily think of the sub or the sub being on the front of them, but it's definitely impacting what these words mean. For instance, what is your subconscious? Notice that I've actually divided this into 3 parts because there are 2 prefixes on the front. We have looked at cone in a previous episode. That's another Latin prefix that means with or together or completely. So the ski part, the shus part there at the end comes from a Latin word that means to know. So your subconscious is under, that's the sub part. What you know, that's the skius or shus part there. And what you know completely, and that's the cone part. So when you put all those parts together, that's where we get our word subconscious today. Now, subject or subject can be a noun or a verb in English. If you subject yourself to something, you are throwing it under something, throwing yourself under something or someone, and that's literally what it means to be a subject of a king or a queen. You are thrown under a heading. The king or the queen is the head of your government. What about a subject in school? Why do we call biology a subject, for instance? We call it that because there's all of these topics and all of these things that you need to learn all under the heading of biology. So biology rules the subject just like the king or queen of some country rules over subjects. And all of this goes back to these 2 Latin words that mean to throw under. And of course, the sub part is the under part. Kind of going along with that, a little harsher, to subjugate literally means to yoke under. You take a yoke to somebody like they're oxen and you subjugate them, you put them under you in terms of power. That is what it means to subjugate. What about subliminal? If something is subliminal, this comes from the Latin phrase that means under the threshold. The threshold is the bottom part of the door that you walk over. And so if something's under the threshold, it's always kind of lurking there, but unless you dig under your door, you're not going to find whatever is under the threshold, which is basically what we mean when we say that something is subliminal. It's under the threshold of our understanding. It's subconscious if you want to use that word. What if somebody or something is subordinate? Ordinate, that word comes from the same root as order. So if something is subordinate, they are ordered or they are ranking under somebody else. That's all it means to be subordinate. Subpoena, we use this word all the time in criminal or legal contexts. It's something that you send to somebody to make them appear in court. It literally just means under penalty in Latin. The poena part means penalty. It's also connected to our word punish. So subpoena means that you are under penalty if you do not do what the court is asking you to do. If something is subsequent, the sequa root means to follow in Latin. And so if something is subsequent, it's following under, which means under in time, essentially. It is going to happen after something else and is going to follow from that other thing. Now, I want to show you a few words where the B at the end of sub is going to assimilate. We've talked about how consonants, especially at the end of some of these little words, do assimilate to following consonants sometimes, and that does happen with the B in sub. So sometimes the B will turn into something else. So for instance, if the next word starts with something like a C, the B will turn into a C, and then you'll get a word spelled with 2 C's. like success, which used to be subces originally in Latin. The kes part means to go, and so success is a going under in the same way that subsequent is a following under, which means after in time. A going under means that it happens afterwards. So the original meaning of the word success was something that happens as a consequence of something else, and then it came to have sort of a positive connotation, like something that happens because you've put in the hard work or something like that that follows from something you have done. Suffer is subfer. We've talked about the pharaoh root, which means to bear or to bring in a previous episode. So to suffer means to bear up under, like something is weighing you down and you are going to toughen yourself up under it. Okay, so you can see some assimilation going on here. Assimilation also happens when the next word starts with a P. So subport became support with two P's. Port means to carry. So support means to carry from below. So if you're supporting somebody, you're sort of like standing underneath them, bearing them up, carrying them, and enabling them to do what they are doing. So that's kind of a cool metaphor when you see it. Let's talk about some other little words here that have something to do with under. How about Greek hypo? Hypo is sort of the answer to the Latin word sub. If you have hypothermia, then you have temperature that is under the norm. If you are a hypocrite, this is an interesting one that will take a little bit of explanation. You are one who sifts under. That Greek root kri or crit means something about sifting, and it can also mean judging, like figuring out what's going on because you're sifting between things. But the original meaning of hypocrite in the Greek language was to be an actor, to play a part in a particular play. You were a hypocrite, which didn't have a negative connotation necessarily when it was originally coined because you were just acting. But the idea is that you are sifting who you really are under a mask. You're wearing some kind of mask and you're pretending to be someone else because you were an actor in a play. So as it turns out, this is something that came to mean someone who is, faking who they are and who is actually somebody else, which is how we use the word hypocrite today. Hypodermic, for instance, if you have like a hypodermic needle, it's something that goes under the skin. That makes sense. Hypotenuse, this is a term that we see often in geometry. It is the line that is stretched under. It's the longest line of a particular kind of triangle. That's the hypotenuse. It's stretched under the other two shorter lines, and the Greeks named it that for that particular quality that it has. A hypothesis is actually just a sub-thesis. You can see the thesis part there, and hypo means under or sub if you want to translate it into Latin. So a hypothesis is just a sub-thesis or a proposition. That's originally at least what that word meant. Another word that means under is Latin infra, which means below, and we have a few words that have infra in them. It looks like infra has something to do with in, but it actually doesn't. Infra means under, and believe it or not, going back to Indo-European is cognate with our Germanic word under. Pretty cool to know. So infrared literally means some kind of color or wavelength that is below red on the spectrum, and that's the infra part. Another place that we see the word infra in everyday English is infrastructure. Infrastructure is that which is built below. So it's not necessarily something you see. You may say that it is subliminal in the sense that you don't really notice it all the time, but it's always supporting you. It's always there under you to make sure that everything is going well. So like roads, bridges, these are things that we don't notice until something goes wrong with them. They are infrastructure because they are supporting everything else that is going on in society. And finally, another word that has to do with under is the Greek word kata, which means down or along or against. Kata is actually a pretty complicated preposition in Greek, and we don't need to go into all the things that it could mean, but its fundamental meaning is down, and everything kind of branches out from there. So for instance, a cataclysm comes from two Greek words that mean a washing down or a washing away. The original meaning of a cataclysm was a flood. Nowadays, when we use the word cataclysm, it doesn't have to be a flood. It can be any kind of disaster that strikes. A catalog literally is a writing down. You're writing down a list of everything, and that is a catalog of whatever it is that you are talking about. That's essentially all a catalog is. A catalyst comes from these two Greek words that mean something that breaks down. The list part means to break or to loosen up the constituents of something. And then kata or kata means down. So you break something down, and a catalyst breaks something down and then causes it to release energy or explode or do whatever it is. And of course, this can be used metaphorically to mean somebody or something who breaks down a certain situation and causes it to, start a chain reaction in society. Catapult, this one's interesting. Originally in Greek, this meant to brandish against. So it was actually just any weapon that you would brandish against somebody, and then it came to be used for a particular kind of weapon that you would brandish or use against an enemy, but that was the original meaning. Catastrophe, this is a word we use pretty often. I kind of like the literal meaning of catastrophe because it doesn't sound that tragic when you literally translate it. It literally means a downturn because the strophe root in Greek means to turn and the kata part means down. So literally a catastrophe. It's a downturn in your fortunes. Things are maybe not going as well as they were before the catastrophe happened. Obviously, this word has gotten worse in modern English and we use it for a very serious downturn in somebody's fortunes. What about a catechism? In certain Christian denominations especially, we talk about people learning the catechism. What is a catechism? You can see the ek there when you split it up like this. Ek is from the same root as echo. So a catechism is an echoing down. You have a list of things you're supposed to learn. You learn them from the priest or whoever it is you were learning them from, and you echo down the list. That's all a catechism is. Sort of staying in the same semantic sphere, a cathedral, the head part in cathedral, the H-E-D part there, comes from the Greek root for to sit. So originally, a cathedral was a room that somebody would sit in, and not just anybody, but usually a king. So a cathedral was originally a place like a throne room for like someone who is a member of royalty to sit. And then Due to some geopolitical changes that happened in the early Middle Ages, this came to be really a church or a place that like a priest would sit or something like that. But that a cathedral literally just means a place for sitting down. Kind of different. Catheter is something sent down. It's something sent down into an artery or a vein or whatever. That's all a catheter means. By the way, you can notice that these last three that we're going to be looking at here have cat instead of kata because the next word starts with an H, and in Greek it would kind of meld together and we get cath, C-A-T-H, but the H is actually part of the second word, not the kata. Finally, going back to the church theme, how about Catholic? The word Catholic actually has the Greek word kata in it. The original meaning of the Greek adjective katholikos was general or pertaining to everybody. That's the original meaning of that adjective because the cat part means down and the whole part is actually the same root as our English word holistic today. If something is holistic, then it encompasses everything. It's not just going to one part of medicine or whatever holistic it is that we're talking about, but if something is holistic, it encompasses everything. So Catholic would have been something that pertains to the whole. It doesn't just pertain to parts. So the original meaning of the Catholic Church was not actually a proper name. It was just an adjective that meant it's the church that pertains to all Christians or pertains to everybody. There was no Protestant Revolution yet, of course, when the church got this name. And so it just meant the general church, the church that applies to everybody. And at one point in history, this was more or less correct, even though today, of course, it has come to be a denomination name that has gotten its name from this adjective that means general or applying to everyone. Okay, let's shift gears and look at the other semantic sphere that we're going to be looking at today, which is over, which is of course the opposite of under. So words that fall into this category will be over, on, above, up. These are the kinds of words we're going to be looking at. Interestingly, we're going to throw another word into this category that might not seem like it fits, but it does, and that word is again, to do something again. Because if you think about it, even in English, when we use the word over, it can mean again. Like I'm going to do that over means I'm going to do that again. And many languages use a word that means something like over or up to mean again or back. All right. So we're going to throw some words that mean again or back into this basket as well. We're going to start with a very common one that, again, just like Latin sub, you know what sub means. You also know what super means. In Latin, super meant over or on or above, and we get a lot of compounds from this word as well. If something is superficial, it's literally on the face or it's on the surface. It doesn't really extend deeper down. If something is superfluous, it is literally flowing over. So it's kind of a similar idea. If something is superfluous, kind of hard to say, it just flows over the topic. It doesn't really penetrate into the topic. It doesn't really seem to be connected to what you are actually interested in. Superior is a word that just comes from Latin that means above, because it has super there at the beginning with a Latin adjective comparative ending there on the end. So superior just means above other things, other people, whatever. Superlative means carried above. So it means that it's better. If you're carried above other people, then you're better than them in some way. Supersede, that seed word comes from the Latin word for to sit. So to supersede means to sit on top of or to cover up. So that if one law supersedes another, it means that it is covering it, and the new law is what's going to count, and the old law is being covered, and so it doesn't really apply anymore. That's essentially what it means to supersede. We talk about supersonic. The word sonic has something to do with sound. So supersonic just means above the speed of sound. That's what that word means. Superstition comes from the Latin for a standing over, and the idea seems to be that if something is superstitious, it's a standing above what is normal. So pretty much everybody in the ancient Mediterranean world was religious, as we would define that term today. They believed in the gods, but even they believed that you could go too far in worshiping the gods or God, and if you did, you might be called superstitious by other people because you're doing something that is above and beyond what is normal, and that's the super part in superstition. Supervise, this is very simple. Super means over. Vise comes from the Latin root for to see. So a supervisor is someone who oversees other people's work. Pretty simple, right? The answer to that in Greek is the Greek word hyper. Once again, I probably don't need to tell you what hyper means because you know what hyper means. We just got it from Greek, just like we got super from Latin. Notice that this is similar. This looks very similar to the Greek word for under, which was hypo. They start with the same 3 letters in our alphabet. So you have to make sure to keep them apart. Hypo is under, hyper is above. And by the way, in case you're wondering, yes, sub and hypo are connected going back to Indo-European, and super and hyper are connected going back to Indo-European. These are fundamentally the same words, in fact. All right, so hyper means over, above, or beyond in Greek. Hyperbole means a throwing over, which means that you're going beyond the truth. You're saying too much. That's basically what it means if something is hyperbolic. This is interesting because this has 2 prepositions or preverbs on the front of it. Hyperextend. Tend means to stretch in Latin. We see now ex means out, so extend means to stretch out. Hyperextend means to stretch out above and beyond what something should normally do or would normally do. So if you hyperextend a particular part of your body, that is literally what you are doing. For those of us who are sci-fi fans, we know about hyperspace, which is of course just a neologism or a new word that has been coined relatively recently for space above and beyond. That's the hyper part, the normal kind. That's essentially what hyperspace is. Hypertension is a health condition that many people have. This is just pressure beyond the norm. That's the hyper part of hypertension. If you are hyperventilating, which I hope you're not so excited by this episode that you're hyperventilating right now, but if you are breathing above and beyond the norm. You are ventilating yourself above and beyond the norm. Another Greek word that is kind of in this category is the Greek preposition and preverb ana, which means up or again or according to. And so we do get some words that have ana or ana on the front of it, like analogy, for instance. An analogy is literally a reckoning up. The log part means a reckoning or a figuring out or a calculation or something like that. So an analogy is a reckoning up. It can also be a reckoning according to something else. So when you make an analogy, you're comparing one thing to another and you are calculating how they are similar and different. And that's the calculating according to part that gives analogies their name. Analysis, we talked about a kata list earlier. A kata list is a breaking down of something. An analysis is a breaking up of something. But if you think about it, breaking something up and breaking something down are not necessarily that different in English, or as it turns out in Greek. What you're doing, whether you are analyzing or being a catalyst, is you are trying to break something up and then figure out what its parts are, and then maybe use those parts in some way. And that's ultimately what an analysis is. And of course, an analyst is somebody who does analysis. How about anatomy? Speaking of subjects in school, anatomy literally just means a cutting up. The tone part means to cut, and the ana part means up. So anatomy is what you get when you cut up a person's body, hopefully dead, or an animal, or whatever it is you're cutting up, to figure out what the different parts of the body are. That's where anatomy gets its name. And then we have anagrams. Anagrams are when you cut up the parts of a word. I use cut again, even though tome isn't in there, but you're taking the parts of a word and you're taking the letters out and you're writing them, and that's the gram part. The gram root in Greek means to write or to use letters specifically. So this could also be translated to letter up or to write up. So an anagram is when you take the letters of a word and you rearrange them, and you can make another word out of the letters of a particular word or phrase. That is what an anagram ultimately is. Now, the answer to ana in Greek, in Latin, is the preverb or it's basically a preverb, because this doesn't really function as a preposition per se in Latin, but the preverb re, or sometimes red, which again, you know this because we've stolen this directly out of Latin. It means again or back, and we can anything, just like we can put sub onto things or super onto things, and we kind of just know what they mean and we use them naturally as if they're a part of English. I think we do the same thing with even though we originally got this from Latin. But here are some examples. To react is to act back in response to something else. That's what a reaction is. And if you were being reactive, that is what you are doing. Rebel, this is actually a pretty interesting one. The re is, of course, back. Bell comes from the Latin word bellum, which meant war, that we see in phrases like antebellum or something like that. Bellicose. These words all have something to do with war. So to rebel means to fight back. That's all it means. Recede means to go back. We saw seed earlier, means to go, and so to recede means to go. By the way, if you have gone back, you were in recess, and that comes from the same Latin root. To receive is to take back, and if you get a receipt for something, then you have taken something back, and maybe the receipt is the thing that you are taking back in response for whatever it is that you are paying for. If you redeem, this is one of the few cases where the D shows up on the end to break up two vowels, basically, because they didn't want to say redeem, so they say redeem, and the D does show up there. To redeem comes from these two Latin words that mean to buy back. That's what it means. That's what redemption is, to buy something back. To reflect means to bend back. That's the flect part. Relative, the lot part, which we have seen before in this episode, means to carry or to bear or to take back. Relative means carried back to a comparison. So if something is relative to something else, it means you can't necessarily analyze it on its own. You have to go back to something else and see how the two things compare. So you're carrying it back to something else and seeing how the two things are related to each other. And of course, we talk about our relatives, people who are in our family, because we have some kind of relationship with them and we can be compared to them in some way too. Now, we just took this word over from French, but ultimately the parts come from Latin. Renaissance means a being born. Again, the naissance part is just French for a birth of some kind. And a report just means something that gets carried back. Oftentimes it's news or something like that that is reported. And of course, a reporter is somebody who carries back news to you. We could really go on for a long time on this one. Maybe I'll do a whole episode on re at some point, because there really are a lot of words that have re on the front of them that we have gotten from Latin. But again, the point of this episode is not to be exhaustive, but simply to show you that these are everywhere. And if you know what re means, you will be able to figure out what a lot of these little words mean. Going along with re and kind of being built off of re is the Latin word retro, which actually means backwards. It has re at the start. So re is back, retro is backwards, so they are similar ideas. Of course, today we use the word retro all the time. Like if something is retro, then we're bringing back something that used to be cool, maybe. That's the idea of something being retro. But of course, we use it as a preverb as well, like retroactive means working in reverse. Retrograde means going backwards. We often use this in astrology, for instance. Mercury is in retrograde, which means that it is going backwards, at least from the perspective of Earth. Retroject means to throw backwards. And retrospective, if we're doing a retrospective, then we are looking back in time and, we're seeing how far we've come and seeing how things used to be back then. That's the meaning of retro in these words. Finally, let's look at two little words that come from Greek that don't really fit into their own semantic category and actually aren't prepositions, but are prefixes that we see all the time, both in Greek and in English, which is why I decided to point them out here. The Greek prefix eu, we usually say you, but it would have been something like eu in Greek, means good or well. So you can put it on the front of something and it means it's a good whatever that thing is. So a eulogy is oftentimes something that is, a speech or something that is given at somebody's funeral. Literally, it just means a good word. It's something that, you say some nice things about a person, and that's a eulogy. A euphemism is literally a good saying or a good way of saying something. So if there's something that, you don't really want to talk about, or it's considered rude socially, you might use a euphemism instead of saying the actual thing. It's a nicer way of saying whatever it is that you want to say. Euthanasia actually just comes from the Greek words for good death. The than part means death in Greek. So euthanasia means good death. It means giving someone a nice, peaceful death. That's actually the root of euthanasia. You probably have heard of the plant, the tree eucalyptus. This was actually given a Greek name, as many things in nature have been given Greek and Latin names. Eucalyptus means well covered in Greek, and it refers to the way that the flower develops. It's covered by something. Originally when it first develops. I'm not a eucalyptus expert, but I do know that this is where the name eucalyptus ultimately came from. So it's ultimately a Greek name. How about the Eucharist? We've been talking about the Catholic Church and catechism, so staying on that a little bit, there are a fair number of Greek words in these ancient Mediterranean religious movements, probably not accidentally. So the Eucharist is something that occurs in a Catholic Mass or in a Catholic service. The word actually comes from two Greek words that mean well favored, and then even in ancient Greek that came to be a verb that means to give thanks. Like if you're well favored, you should give thanks to God or the gods for blessing you and giving you what you have, and that came to be the name that was applied to the central part of a Catholic Mass, the taking the bread and the wine as a symbol of the body and blood of Christ. That's called the Eucharist, and it comes from these two Greek words. The opposite of eu in Greek was dys. Now, this is not the same as dis, and sometimes people mix these up. We've looked at dis from Latin on a previous safari in this series. Dis in Latin means apart from or away from or something like that. Like to disassemble means to take the parts of something and rip them apart. That's the apart part in dis, whatever it is, with an I. That's not the same as dis with a Y. Dis with a Y comes from Greek, and it means bad or poorly. It doesn't mean apart or away from or something like that. So, if something is dysfunctional with a Y, it means having bad function. It functions poorly. That's what it means when something is dysfunctional. If somebody has dyslexia or they are dyslexic, literally it means they have a word disorder. There's something off about their perception of words. In this case, we usually use it with the written word, but etymologically, it can be any kind of word disorder. Dystopia literally means a bad place. It's a place that, is kind of, not working out so well. Maybe people thought that they could make it a utopia. If we go back to the last slide, a utopia is a good place, but a dystopia is oftentimes what utopias tend to turn into. They turn into bad places because somebody screwed it up and didn't see things coming. Dysentery is an illness that, has perhaps been made famous in our generation by the computer game Oregon Trail, which I've given you a screenshot from here. So dysentery is literally just a disease characterized by bad insides. The dys is bad. The enter part is actually connected to the roots that we were looking at in the last safari that have something to do with insides. So your entera in Greek are your insides, which they use to mean your intestines. So dysentery means there is something wrong with your intestines. You have an intestinal disorder, and that's literally, etymologically, all that disease means. Finally, if you have dysphoria, you're taking something poorly. There's something off, and you don't really necessarily like what it is, or you are not necessarily handling it. Well, that is what it means to have dysphoria. So once again, eu or you is good, and dys with a y is bad. Once you see these, you can definitely remember them. Okay, we're going to end there. This has been a very long series. We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a lot of these little words that have a big impact. I hope that you've been interested by this and that you've learned a lot, and that, when you're out there speaking English, if you speak English on a daily basis or however frequently that you do it, that you will notice these words and notice these little parts of words, and that they will mean more to you than they did before. See you next time.